Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, Director of Century International. Today, I'm here with Nate Schenkkan and Angela Hanks, two colleagues at the Century Foundation, and we're here to talk about the perilous state of democracy in America. Now, anyone who follows the news knows that a lot of terrible things have been happening in the United States and in the world over the last year, but we wanted to put a number on it and ask, how is the state of American democracy? And Nate Schenkkan, a longtime independent human rights researcher, helped us put together an index that measures the state of American democracy against two benchmark points, the beginning of 2024, the beginning of 2025. So listeners won't be surprised to learn that the findings were stark and alarming. And in a second, I'm going to turn to Nate so he can tell us what those are. And just so you know who you're listening to, Nate is the former senior director of research at Freedom House, and Angela Hanks is my boss at Century and is the chief of policy programs here. So without further ado, I'm going to start by asking Nate about this democracy index. Nate, welcome to Order from Ashes. Tell us what you found when you put together the new democracy meter for TCF.
Yeah, thanks, Thanassis and Angela, and thanks for having me on. So when we put together this new index, this democracy meter, we sort of started from the place of asking ourselves about this biggest story that's happening really in democracy studies globally, which is what's happening in the US, asking ourselves, how would we actually analyze that systematically and categorically in ways that would be comparable to some of the other indices and other systems that have been set up over the years by other projects. So we reference these in the report, but you have things like the Varieties of Democracy Project, Freedom House, of course, and Freedom in the World. And we really felt like there was a need for another contribution here for various reasons related to what's happening more broadly in the democracy studies field.
Something we'll get into a little later in the podcast about the other indexes and why.
Yeah, looking at it a little more concretely. So what we did is we set up a new 100-point scale. 100 points is just to try to keep it simple and clear. And to give us a baseline, we did a 2024 assessment for calendar year 2024, and then we did a 2025 assessment. And bottom line up front, the 2024 assessment had the U.S. at a score of 79 out of 100, which is, however you want to think of that, a C plus, right? If we're using grading. And
we tried to avoid grading because we don't want to think about this as like a student who's going to get kicked out of school, since we can't really go to another school.
Because the 2025 came down to a 57 out of 100. So we had a really, really large drop. Obviously we don't know what other indices are going to do, but I think that drop is reflective. Obviously I worked on this pretty hard, and I think the drop is reflective of the things that people have been reading and thinking and protesting about in the United States. In particular, a huge drop in how state institutions are performing from a democratic perspective. So is the executive constrained in doing whatever it feels like? I think we could go through in this podcast or anywhere else and talk about those examples.
Yeah, and before we get into those details, Nate, I want to linger for a minute on the big picture findings that you reached. So a drop from 79 to 57, 79 already pretty low if we're thinking about a healthy democracy being something that would get in the mid 80s to low 90s. So already not doing great in terms of democratic practices, healthy, sustainable democratic practices. This sudden drop to 57, you put a name on this, right? You said that first year score of 79 is weak, but I forget the way you described it. 57 you said is authoritarian. Tell us why that big drop represents a real, like a change in state.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest way to explain it is we have a list of things that authoritarian governments do when we work on studying democracy. And those are things that we see this government doing. So we see when courts rule against them, they simply say, you don't have the power to do that. You can't stop us from returning these people. You can't make us return these people from El Salvador. We see them saying that people who are opponents of the regime, if we were talking about a different country setting, are being politically persecuted. They're having prosecutions brought up against them at the direction of the president. We see that specific disfavored groups, I mean, particularly immigrants or people who are, might be coded as immigrants by the law enforcement authorities, are being targeted in mass campaigns of persecution. And those are all behaviors that, I think anybody who studies democracy or studies governments around the world would describe as the policies of an authoritarian government. And they're being implemented quite widely and very aggressively. And so, yeah, we put those into categories and we put those into scores and we see them drop. But really what it comes down to is what the behaviors are and what the actions are. And are those actions being stopped or being checked by other institutions and therefore unable to move forward?
Now, Angela, when we started talking late last summer, as we were taking stock of some of the many alarming developments in U.S. governance and rule of law, what were the big questions that you were curious about that helped lead us to this project?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I'm going to take a big step back. I promise this is not a promotion for the Century Foundation, but just for listeners who might not know the full breadth of our work, I think it's important in this context. So the Century Foundation, we're an over 100-year-old or well, we've been different things in different eras, but think tank that works across a range of domestic and international policy issues. We have bodies of work on areas like healthcare, childcare, education, labor, and a very broad international portfolio. And as we were starting to see some of the actions that this administration was taking, and really, I think you can see it show up so clearly in Nate's analysis, much of the policy work that we do is directed toward government, right? Like we want government to act in these areas of healthcare, of education, of labor, of international affairs. And so it is important for us as an institution and as people who are in the world doing this type of work to really understand the state of our government. And I think as we were looking across each of these policy areas, you started to see quite visibly, and people have seen reported on this, the kind of deterioration in state institutions, what that means for non-state sectors, what that means for our rights, and all of those things are related, right? So thinking about why this project is both important for us as researchers and analysts at the Century Foundation, but also more broadly for those of us who are interested in coming up with policies that cause the government to act in a way that is beneficial for people. It's important to understand where it is becoming more difficult for government to do that, or where government has stopped doing that altogether. I was really struck by the state institutions section where you saw the sharpest decline because these are the institutions that our policy recommendations are often directed at, right? Like if you are trying to improve working conditions for workers, but the agency that you're directing at no longer sort of follows the normal rules and laws that they're required to abide by, that's both concerning for the work that we're doing, but also for our democracy writ large. And what I really like about this project is it helps us sort of quantify the places where that's happening and better understand what that means, not just for the work that we're doing here at Century, but also for the kind of broader project of making our democracy healthier, more inclusive, stronger for people across the country. So the results themselves are, of course, quite depressing, and I'm sure we'll talk much more about that. But I think this is an interesting thing for us to understand as people who are trying to think about and advance policy in this country as we're going through these kind of major changes to our democracy that are often making people worse off than they are before.
Yeah. And one of the things that came up in our early conversations over the summer and fall were that, of course, we were alarmed by these apparent erosion of democratic practices, emergence of new authoritarian norms. At the same time, like I think many people, we wanted to be careful, not to judge the situation by our emotions, which, I can say my emotions are fear and anxiety as I behold what's happening in the United States and the global order. But I don't want that to be my measure, my yardstick of how bad things are and crucially, whether they're reversible. So one of the genesis of this project was to say, like, okay, let us list define our own criteria for democratic practices so that we can measure for our own satisfaction where things are. So it's not just how bad do things feel, but where are they based on some criteria so that we can have a little bit of a check. And the other piece of this was, I sit at this intersection of international policy and domestic policy, which, I've, as any listener of this podcast knows, I think are there's a real false dichotomy, and they're actually one and the same. But there's a real norm in the United States of exceptionalizing everything about America, right? So like we have American experts in democracy who assess democracy around the world, people like Nate, and then we don't expect them to use the same vocabulary when they talk about the United States, as if this is like a different planet from every other place on in the world. Nate, I want you to talk a little bit, if you can, about how you constructed this. You've spent decades at a place that does this for every country in the world, and here you were building an index that's this U.S. specific. How is it different to do a U.S. democracy meter like you built for us here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so on one level, like you're suggesting, it's not different, and that's what's important, right? So the idea here, and to reflect a little bit on what Angela said too, the idea was to try to focus in on sort of the sine qua non, like the things you cannot do without to have a functioning democracy. So really, because you can define democracy in a lot of different ways. You can get down to a very, very, very fine level of detail. And that can be helpful, but it can also get in the way of understanding. So to try to take a very basic understanding of these different institutions and different sectors. On one level, that's the comparable part. You could do this for any country in the world. Other people do. On the other level, I do think that there's something really interesting and unique, and it was certainly interesting for me as an American who has mostly worked on other countries. I mostly worked on Central Asia and Turkey in terms of my regional expertise, and I used to live in those places and really focus on governance and democracy in those places. It's really interesting to sit down and look at the United States uniquely, right? And try to reflect on the things about the United States that you can look within a broader framework that would apply to any country, but are also unusual and unique about the United States. I don't want to say exceptional, because that I think has a sort of superlative quality to it, but unique. I mean, the United States is a weird country.
Specificity rather than specialness.
Yeah, it's a weird country. We have a weird history. Our constitutional history is very strange. Our Constitution is very strange. And frankly, from the perspective of modern democracies, and this is something I've studied and worked on over the years, we have a very strange system. Right. This is an unusual system. And
explain to our listeners how we quantify this, because I mean there's a long history which I don't like of sort of essentializing democracy and talking about it as like a cultural value or like a state of being. And I think that good democracy work looks at behavior and practices, so it sort of takes it out of the realm of like who you are or what you believe, and just says like, what are you doing? So can you explain what the sort of, the terms democracy versus democratic practices are? And also, while you're at it, can you unpack a little bit what we mean when we say state, government, and regime, which get thrown around with, I think, different implications?
Right. To take the first part, I mean, about how we broke it down and how we kind of looked at the different categories. So again, this is trying to look at it in a very straightforward liberal democracy kind of 101 way, which is you have institutions of the state. In this case, we can break them down in the American context: the executive, Congress, the judiciary. And you're going to look at, is the executive constrained? Is it when it acts outside of its legal boundaries? Does someone stop it? You're going to look at the independence of these other institutions that are naturally always going to be threatened or at danger of being overrun by the executive in Congress and the judiciary. Then we also included in that a grand corruption indicator, because corruption is one of these issues that just cuts across everything and can undermine any functioning state, including a democracy. Then a second major category that we had was non-state sectors. And again, trying to keep that pretty basic, because this can get very detailed, but the media and social media, the civil society, and higher education, and really focusing in these on their independence, So their ability kind of to function as independent sectors, right? Independent of the state, but also independent of each other or independent of other kinds of coercion or control. And their vibrancy and sustainability, which is something that I think has been an increasing trend in thinking about democracies, that we have to focus as well on, are these things functioning like as sectors in terms of their ability to be vibrant. And then rights, is the third category. And taking, again, very basic kind of civil rights approach to this around freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom from arbitrary detention. Obviously, with rights, you could go down to a lot of detail, and there's a lot of work one could do, but we're trying to keep this at the most kind of core level. And equality before the law being the other dimension here, equality before the law and due process. And then last, elections. So one of the ways, of course, democracy gets essentialized as a system is, and I should say, there's a whole strand of political science that thinks about it this way, which is, a democracy is a system that has elections in which power changes hands, right?
So elections for show, like say Turkey has, will count the same way. And Nate, is it right to say, because I mean, I think part of what I'm hoping this index does, and I think it does, is take the feelings out of the assessment, right? So like, this assessment enables us to say, like, it doesn't matter how obnoxious public officials being in the way they talk or what the tone is, or even if someone is like using racist rhetoric or offensive, anti-foreign, xenophobic words. What matters is what they are doing with regards to equality before the law or treatment of immigrants, right? Is that right? That's what this index enables us to do?
I hope so. I'm always beware to say it doesn't matter. I think it matters maybe in its own ways, but for the index, where does that come in? Perhaps not at the level that we're seeing right now. I mean, I think we're well past that Rubicon, right, in the United States, where we have, the president calls Somali immigrants garbage, and then he literally sends federal forces to a city that has a very large Somali population to have people do wide-scale detentions of that community.
Raids, by the way, that remind me a lot of what I used to see on the ground in Iraq, but actually look worse, because in Iraq, American soldiers wouldn't smash people's car windows open like they're doing routinely.
So it crosses into policy, right? And that's where I think, I don't want to say, so I agree with you. Yeah, we're trying to take the emotions out in some sense. There's always going to be emotions. There's always going to be feelings about this, but it is focused on policy. It is focused on actions and behaviors, and that's what we're trying to record. And I hope that we can record in the project.
Can you quickly say something about what we mean by regime, state, government?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a tricky set of terms. I mean, normally, in most other countries, when people talk about the government, what they're talking about is the elected the elected government. So in a parliamentary system, when you have a government, that's who comes in. Every time there's an election, they form a government, right? We don't have that system. We don't have that tradition in the U.S. But we basically have that de facto, in that when the president is elected, he names a cabinet, it gets approved, that becomes the government. State institutions, is broader. So the state institutions encompasses all of these different institutions, like Congress, like the judiciary, as well as the ones within what we call the executive branch in the U.S. And in that sense, when we talk about the state, we're really talking about something a little bit larger than just the government. And regime, of course, I think formally means kind of the circumstances and the set of institutions, much even more broadly, like it's the sort of nature of the experience of being in that society. And so but often, frankly, in these contexts, it's used in a kind of pejorative way, right? When we talk about regimes,
in journalism, a regime is a government you don't like.
Yeah, exactly. It's an authoritarian regime. You don't hear someone say a democratic regime.
A fantastic regime.
Of course, you could say that. Yeah, exactly. And so, I would say on the first two is really the key for this index. We try to be clear when we're talking about the state and when we're talking about the government, or in American vernacular, maybe more the administration, right? Which is more what we say. And try to distinguish where those actions are coming from, because I do think that that's going to be helpful and useful going forward.
You're listening to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, director of Century International. Today, we're talking about Century's new democracy meter, which shows with some precision the extent of the authoritarian turn America has taken in the last year. I'm joined by Nate Schenkkan, an independent democracy researcher who helped build the index, and by Angela Hanks, the director of policy programs here at the Century Foundation. This index was released on Thursday, January 15th, and that's when we're recording this conversation. So by the time you're listening a few days from now, who knows what crazy or outrageous things might have happened in the world. But as of the day we're recording, Angela, I want to ask you, were you surprised by the score and by the extent of the drop from last year to this year?
When I saw the score, I would say I was both completely blown away and then not surprised at all at the same time. So completely blown away in that, seeing a 28% drop year over year is startling. And when you see a number that's in the 50s on a scale of 100, of course, all of us do go to those gradings that we got in school, right? And you start to think, okay, well, that's a failing grade. That's pretty devastating for us as a country. And frankly, for me, one of the questions it raised is like, do I think that we get an F, right? Like I can't, I think, accurately compare us to other countries. I don't know the international context in every place in the world, but it feels extreme. And then when you look below the surface, all of a sudden that 28% drop starts to make a lot of sense. Because when I do think about the way that I have seen, for example, state institutions degraded over this last year, that really intense decline in the state institution category makes a lot of sense, right? Like we at the Century Foundation spent a lot of the beginning of the year, but I would say throughout the year, doing things to both analyze the impact of and in some instances push back against really devastating moves to dismantle and disrupt the operations of the federal government, whether that is making it more difficult to provide things that used to be, more readily available, like public education in this country, or services like healthcare or childcare. Many of those things have just been broken. Again, I don't want to say irreparably because I think there is some opportunity to rebuild here, but the swiftness with which those things happen is really astonishing. I worked at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau before I came to the Century Foundation. That is a federal agency that was authorized by Congress that is now functionally closed. They have ceased basically all operations. Some of those operations, by the way, include supervising banks, conducting enforcement actions against the biggest financial institutions in our country that are breaking the law. Those operations have stopped, and that does a couple of things. One, it degrades democracy, but two, it really invites corruption, right? Like there is a whole set of actors that exist in our economy, in our society right now, for whom the signal has been, it is open season on working people, on average people. You can do whatever you want, and the federal government will not lift a finger to respond. So anyway, just thinking about the kind of experiences that I have seen just firsthand in how state institutions have really been deeply under attack during this period, that doesn't surprise me at all. I will also say there were areas where I was surprised that it came out actually higher than I was expecting. And we've talked about this a little bit, but in that category of rights, so much of what I think is front of mind for all of us at every moment right now, and especially right now because of what's happening in Minnesota, is the real aggression from ICE, from federal law enforcement, that has both been deeply targeted at immigrants, but is also now expanding to, do you live in a city I don't like, right? Like that being the criteria. And so there, on the one hand, I was expecting such a steeper decline because we have all seen and some of us experienced within our families or communities these really visceral attacks. And one of the things that actually raises for me is both like a question about like thinking about the severity, but also thinking about where we were beforehand too. Like that is, I think, an important thing to not lose in this is it's, we had a 79 in 2024. It's not a 100. It's not a perfect score. And so you can have this reality where things are getting much worse and there's steep declines in particular areas and a real acknowledgement that how we were doing before 2025 really had some deep flaws for many people, for the country writ large beforehand too. So anyway, I think there's a lot of interesting things in the scores, but part of this I think is really grappling with where we were as a country beforehand, and then being able to account for those large scale changes that we've seen that have ripple effects across our entire country, across our economy, and across the world.
I mean, this is a long running theme of the progressive critique of American governance and American power, right? I mean, we are a progressive, nonpartisan institution that's been speaking truth to power for more than a century, and we've had a lot to say to administrations of every partisan stripe about their shortcomings when it comes to delivering good governance and respecting people's rights. I want to go a little bit into detail on this question of rights, because we did have some good discussions about this during the scoring process. So out of a maximum total possible of 25 points, at the 2024 score was 19 on rights, and now is 15. We questioned whether that was low enough on both of those scores. And actually, in the process, we did lower from the scores from the initial ones. Maybe both you can jump in here. I was going to ask Nate first. How do you see those scores? And I guess the question I have, and maybe your listeners have, is what does it take to get to zero? Like, if there's 15 points left to fall, like what is that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple different, I can answer it in a couple different ways. I mean, first of all, I'll just say for me, part of this is sort of methods and like trying to think about this stuff critically, like I always did at Freedom House, during all of that work. And so part of that is thinking about, if an indicator, say expression, it's got 5 points, we're really talking about 5 different quintiles, right, within which you could fall 0 to 20, 20 to 40, et cetera. And within that, you want to appreciate that a 0 to 20 probably means something, right, far worse than what we're seeing right now. I mean, here we are recording a podcast, right, in a think tank. I mean, Thanassis.
And right? If none of us have gone to jail by the time this airs, you can say that we're still at a 57.
And I don't want to be, but like, Thanassis, I know you and I have, Angela, kids, but like, I've worked in places, I've been in prisons, I've visited people in prisons who are political prisoners for doing stuff that isn't so different from this. And that's not what's happening in the US yet. That's not where we are, right? That's not what's taking place right now at this exact moment. It is, though, very scary. And I have, in the last year, in my own personal experience, as well as in what I've read and the people I've talked to, I've seen people silence themselves. So I did start to see people in civil society, what we would call civil society in the international space, right, in human rights NGOs and working on this stuff, pull back, take down their social media feeds, pull down posts, change their language, delete apps. Saw a lot of stuff. And that's because they were scared. They were scared of retribution from the government. So it is complicated, right, to maintain, I think, that perspective and understand that there's both very real fear in a direct way as well as space, and also that it's unevenly distributed. Like, Angela, what you're talking about, I mean, that it hits different communities very differently. I mean, this has always been the case. This is always the case in every society. Rights are not evenly protected. If we talk about the protection of rights within a certain country, we're always talking about it being done unevenly, right? On class, on racial grounds, on geographic location, religion, ethnicity, right? And the United States is not different in that way. It is very unevenly distributed. People have different ability to exercise those rights. And so you don't want to, I would argue, you don't want to like overstate it by saying, well, because I can do this, right? I can write a think tank report about this at a New York-based think tank, that it's free. But you also don't want to overstate it the other direction and say that because certain people are being targeted on the basis of ethnicity or on the basis of their immigration status, that's what's happening to everyone, because it's not. And it is important, I think, to try to balance those things.
Angela, did you want to elaborate on that? I mean, I know when we talked about the early stages of this project, one of the interesting things that we discussed was sort of bringing some of the granular knowledge that we tend to apply to international contexts back to the U.S. That authoritarianism and democracy aren't like an on-off switch; they're a continuum, and in authoritarian contexts, there are still some rights and processes that still exist to contest some amounts of policy and power, and so trying to bring some nuance to this extensive gray area that we were already in, frankly, when we were at a 79 score, and that we're deeper into now. And like, God forbid, we drop to 30. That doesn't mean there is no politics or no stakeholder voice. It just means there's a lot less of it. So I'm curious, partly, how has your understanding of that shifted over the last year, both as you've observed the changes in the U.S. and also as a result of doing this project?
Yeah. So I want to say one thing quickly, just going back to rights for a moment, which is one of the things I think that is really helpful about this is, and you give a nod to this in the paper, comparing kind of where we are right now in this era to the pre-civil rights era, right? Which I think is like, for me, was useful context, because we are in a moment where we are seeing people's civil rights and liberties being violated in all of these deeply disturbing ways. And like the context that not my parents, but my grandparents, I certainly were born into, was a context where they did not have equal rights based on their race, and that was enshrined in law. And so like one of the things to think about now that is not particularly hopeful in this moment, because I think the courts are not being as helpful as they could, but we do have this forward and backward progress where there are a set of laws that are very frequently being violated at this moment, and many people who are taking steps to stand up to the administration and their actions by going to the courts for some relief. And I just mentioned that because I think that it is helpful both to think about it in the context that like it is very frightening to think that we are back in that pre-civil rights era in some ways, and some comfort to know that there are laws, that there are safeguards, even in a deteriorating democracy, that both exist and can be built to pull us out of this. So anyway, just mentioning that because I think it was helpful for me to think about this in sort of the long arc of where we've been in America to where we are now, and that it is possible to move on. For me, thinking about the implications both for our work in the moment and the international comparisons, Thanassis, I take your point earlier that the domestic and international contexts and sort of the wall between those two areas of policy is probably somewhat artificial. But as someone who has spent my career thinking of myself as like a domestic policy person, someone who doesn't have enough knowledge in the international space to weigh in, one of the reasons why this index was really clarifying is because I will just say candidly, of course, I think about the state of American democracy and society all the time as someone who lives here, who is a citizen, who's an active participant in our democracy. And doing that, you can also take it quite for granted, right? Like there is like a certain you were talking about it earlier, like exceptionalism or essentialism or whatever, that many of us can fall into, where it's hard to sort of take that step back and think about, okay, if I'm taking a very sober look at what is happening across institutions, it is not unfair for me to understand this as a democracy that is in deep and rapid decline, and think about what that means for the work that we're all doing. Again, as someone who works in a New York-based think tank, who is just thinking about both what can happen on the like policy research analysis advocacy side to help stem the harm in this moment, and ideally think about how to rebuild from here. It is really important to understand the pieces that are about democracy, right? Like I think you could very easily be like, okay, well, I'm an econ person, and so I'm just thinking about like what are the economic policies that could be passed in 2 or 4 or 8 or whatever years. But instead, I think being able to grapple with what does this mean for the system that we have, and how do we think about institutions as something to rebuild, not policies just to be passed, and how do we think about those institutions as also being living things, right? Like, if anything is clear over the last year, it's that we really have to think of these institutions both as in need of kind of like constant repair and upkeep and minding by people who will uphold the laws of this country. And when that doesn't happen, they can fall pretty quickly. So I think there's a lesson here both about, what's happening this moment, but also how we think about the work that we would do across a whole host of areas in the future as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a symbiotic relationship between democracy, democratic practices, democratic institutions on the one hand, and these governance outcomes that you're talking about on the other. And I find Nate's framework very helpful because it helped me focus on some of the long-term erosions that have accelerated under the second Trump administration. So, I mean, one of the things you really center, Nate, in your findings are weak accountability by the branches of government other than the executive, right? Congress, and I mean, a quarter century ago after 9/11, Congress chose not to act as a check or partner on executive power in war making in response to 9/11, right? And now, 20 plus years later, we see that inability to be a robust counterweight has just become like a permanent state of affairs. There's a bunch of examples like that. Another one I find really interesting when you take this sort of global approach and apply it back to the US, it becomes clear how lack of accountability for corruption and criminal behavior it's a norm here, right? So across the world, heads of state are constantly put on trial after they serve, right? It's a normal, it happens in France, it happens in healthy democracies where heads of state abuse their power, do something corrupt, and then they go to prison. And democracy doesn't collapse, governance doesn't collapse. It turns out to be just fine. It's no big deal. Same with police violence.
If anything, you could argue the opposite, was that it's an important part of democracies remaining healthy.
Right. Maybe that's why they don't have January 6th style insurrections, because there is this amount of accountability. So I find it interesting to look. I mean, you've published 2024 and 2025 scores here, but we can sort of look at some of these trends going much further back. And I think we say in this report that the previous low point is basically before the Voting Rights Act was passed, right? So the last time things were this bad in the U.S. was like in the early 60s, when a whole bunch of Americans, including people of color, were just not allowed to vote. And it's, I think, shocking but not surprising that that's a similar place to where we are today. And we've gotten there without mass disenfranchisement, which in a way is extra scary, because that means we have a whole lot of room to fall in terms of stripping the franchise from people who currently vote. It's become a thing talked about in politics to talk about stripping some Americans of their citizenship, right? That's a policy that's being explored. So Nate, I want to change. So we're almost at 40 minutes here. Let me just reintroduce us. This is Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's podcast. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, the director of Century International, and I'm talking to Angela Hanks, our director of policy programs, and Nate Schenkkan, the lead author of our new democracy meter, which shows America's authoritarian turn over the last year. On this last segment, I want to talk a little bit about reversibility and sort of implications of this finding. So of this project. So let's start, Nate, with what your report shows about the sort of human agency at play here, and how, if at all, this plummet, this erosion could be reversed.
Yeah, so I think human agency is obviously a big part of the report and a part of what we're trying to describe accurately, which is sets of choices by specific policymakers to dismantle institutions or to take extra power, or in specific cases on the other side to be complicit in that or to go along with it, particularly from Congress and the Supreme Court, and try to just state those things very clearly. I think that the other part of this that I think we always want to keep in mind is that when we talk about an authoritarian setting or a state behaving in an authoritarian manner, again, there's a spectrum of behavior within which that still operates. And there's a very important set of ideas that's come into discussion in the last few decades in democracy studies around competitive authoritarianism and around the idea of continuing to have elections, continuing to have frameworks in which people can compete over power. I wouldn't say we're applying that strictly in this case, but it is important to note that in the analysis, and I felt that this was correct, and I kind of tried to double and triple check this as I was working on it. The elections category is the only one that didn't go down from 2024 to 2025. Elections in the United States are very decentralized. They're the constitutional responsibility of the states. That's a very strong constitutional directive. It's set out. It's never really something that the federal government's been able to change, for better or worse in certain cases. And that it has been a protection. It was a protection in 2020, right? When the first Trump administration tried to do a bunch of stuff with state elections. It's likely to be a protection in 2026 and beyond. And I think that is certainly one of the things that we all need to be thinking about in January 2026 is what does this next year look like? And what does it look like as we have an electoral system where the president and his party have committed themselves to policies that are trying to make that system less representative, right? They're trying to make that system work less well, trying to specifically exclude people from being able to vote.
Is this election score too high? I mean, so that's the one, out of a possible score of 15, we rated elections at 12, and it stayed steady at 12 year on year. So that's, more or less free and fair elections for now.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to avoid free and fair because I'm not a big fan of that framework in the first place. And I think the fair part, especially in the United States, is really complicated because of this weird counter-majoritarian system we have.
And Citizens United.
Citizens United and campaign finance, but also the Electoral College, the Senate, which is itself a counter-majoritarian institution, right? Creates overrepresentation of less populated states. Like that's what it's designed to do, which over time, I think when it was designed was not a huge deal for the U.S. population, but it's now like a really big problem. It was a huge deal
because it was partly designed to keep slavery intact, right? I mean, it's
certainly that part, but I mean in the sense that the distribution of population now is so stark, right, between different states in the United States that this really is like a problem for the equal representation of voters' will, in addition to non-representation of District of Columbia, non-representation of Puerto Rico, a whole lot of other issues there, gerrymandering, of course.
People with criminal records being
exactly. Yeah,
I mean, there's like all
disenfranchisement.
Kinds of things, right?
There's all of these things that I tried to, and these are really in the 24 report, primarily, if people want to read them, that's where we discuss them. At the same time, the system works in the sense that power rotates, elections are held, votes are counted. I do think that part of the system and that aspect of the system works. And that's not something I take for granted. I think that's not a given in any system. And that's really going to be the next frontier. And I do think we're going to see in 26 a lot of attacks on the system itself. And they will be rhetorical. The rhetoric has already happened. But they may go further. We're seeing the federal government start to sue states over voter registration lists, trying to acquire information from states about voter registration so that they can try to remove or control voter rolls, remove voters from the rolls. So there's some very serious threats going on in the electoral sector. But that said, I do think that we're in a very competitive environment politically. I don't think it would be appropriate. I would not feel comfortable as an analyst to say to somebody, no, the United States is not going to have competitive elections in 2026, in which power could change.
And I guess the clear implication of your research here is that that's the case now, and there's no guarantee that continues to be the case indefinitely. I mean, just as the bulwark that the judiciary has provided and is no longer providing as robustly, right? That's dropped off. The competitiveness of elections, the competitiveness of elections could also drop off. So the conclusion I take from your scoring here is that like this can be reversed through elections for now, right? And that is, like, I guess we'll find out when we do our 2026 report, whether we still think that, or how much that's still the case. But these things are all in flux. And I'd add one other thing, which is just that I think there's been a bipartisan erosion of democratic practices going back several decades, right? I mean, there's been a lot of laziness about due process, a lot of laziness about like really caring about fighting things like Citizens United, or disenfranchising not just felons, but just random people who officials in one state or another didn't really want to have on the voter rolls, right? These kinds of practices. Of course, many people care, but on the whole, American elites in power have been not that concerned with these issues until now, right? And so this could be a salutatory crisis if it leads to a sort of revival of rule of law and due process and fairness, which benefits everyone, by the way, if you do it. And it reminds me a little bit of the period in the 70s when, the Church Commission, I mean, this is a little bit more focused on foreign affairs, but where after like decades of it becoming normalized for the U.S. to just like try and murder heads of state abroad that it didn't like and overturn different Latin American governments it didn't like and all kinds of like crazy, terrible stuff that led to misery for millions of people and was also a strategic disaster. At some point, the U.S. Congress was like, wait a second, we have powers. And they had the Church Commission hearings and they passed, the War Powers Act. And there was this sort of brief moment where there was like a robust Congress willing to check the executive. And, that, I don't know how many minutes or months that period lasted, but we're definitely not in such a period now. And I wonder if democracy survives or reemerges out of this period, if there might be a new American consensus for these kinds of norms that used to be widely shared.
I think certainly one of the things I've taken out of it very strongly is that whatever comes after this, if there's an opportunity, there has to be an institutional push. There has to be a bit more focus on institutions and on institutional weakness in the United States, because what's happening now is plowing right through vulnerabilities that were pretty obvious, to be honest, in over the last several decade or more, and I think have become very clear in terms, and again, are connected to some of the things that are very strange and unusual about the United States from a perspective of modern democratic practice.
Nate, are other democracies based on stronger procedural or institutional or legal norms that would prevent, let's say, a head of state from being able to disband, let's say, an institution like the one Angela used to work for, or USAID? Like how does that work in a healthier democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that has come down to those kinds of actions, some of which we talk about in the report, have come down to the judicial check and the absence of a judicial check in the United States. And I think, as probably anyone listening to this podcast knows, that's an outcome at this point of a very purposeful Republican strategy over a very long period of time to control the Supreme Court. You can go back to McConnell, Senate Leader McConnell refusing to let Barack Obama nominate a justice right at the end of Obama's term. You can go back to Trump getting to nominate a justice after he'd already lost an election, right? I mean, there's been a whole bunch of stuff here that flows out of other kinds of breakdowns in power. And it really isn't about, a specific legal institution at that point. It's about the much larger kind of constitutional questions about how will these institutions be formed, and will there be kind of overbearing influence over those institutions, and will there be a concerted effort to capture them? Right. I mean, that's where we're at the I wouldn't say the end point, but we're at a progressive stage. We're at a very well developed stage of capture of institutions by a certain kind of project, which is very ambitious and isn't particularly, would certainly disagree with the conclusions of this report, I guess is what I would say.
Well, and Angela, I don't know if this is a question you feel ready to explore at this moment, but I'm intrigued by the intersection of the affordability agenda and the governance agenda with the like rights and democracy agenda. I think those things are deeply interrelated, even when I can't exactly point to the causal connections. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of closing thoughts as we wrap up this conversation today about how this democracy meter speaks to the questions of like Americans struggling to get by and find a way to live day to day.
Yeah, I mean, I think at a very basic level, one way to think about it is like all of these things that we're talking about on the like erosion of democracy side have an impact on people's day-to-day lives, right? Like some of the actions of the administration, just going back to the CFPB again, to shutter the agency, to walk back on rules and guidance that the agency uh, issued in previous years. All of those things are both being contested in court right now and have an impact on people's day-to-day lives, right? And so I think the kind of most direct way to think about this for me is like when you have a Department of Education or National Labor Relations Board or Health and Human Services that is not operating lawfully, that is going to have an impact on people across the country. And I think not only does the sort of like the question of like lawfulness really matter, but also, people one of the things I was trying to be careful of was to distinguish between like laws and norms, because I do think, I mean, one, I sometimes have like an issue with, I think like on the left, there could be sort of like a love of norms so much that it's like trying to get an A+ on the law. And like, we should make sure that our institutions are following the law, and norms are important for our values as a society. But really what we're seeing is like, is kind of contested legal spaces across the board in all of these places. But like one way to think about it is like, there is a world where these things happen where, people want to see a different set of things happen at the federal level. And they are both electing, people in the executive branch, but also Congress. And there are members of the judiciary who are appointed who like have a relationship in making those things happen, right? Like if you want to eliminate an agency, you go to Congress, and they do that, and people can sort of like make those decisions at all kinds of levels about whether that is the type of government that they want or not. One of the consequences of just sort of like bypassing all of the laws and doing that is you sort of like remove some of the checks along the way that allow people to weigh in on whether they want that or not. So, there is a question about like, are they doing things that are making people's lives harder? I think like substantively, yes, because of the actions. And I would argue that like, because of this erosion in democracy, it's also harder and harder for people to be able to weigh in on whether they think that is good forward progress or backward progress, things that make their lives better or easier or more difficult. And that's a problem too. And then the maybe the last thing I would say, just kind of connecting the way that people are feeling right now, when you have a government that is corrupt, that is not operating to the benefit of the people, that is operating to the benefit of a small select number of people who have very direct access to people in power, you are not going to get policy outcomes that that benefit the majority of people, right? Like that just like, there's no incentive for that to happen. And that is I think one of the other casualties among many of not having a functioning democracy is you don't get a system that provides things like a fair labor market or affordable healthcare or childcare or education or kind of like public goods more broadly, because the interests are not in the public. They're of these private interests that, again, have more access to power. So anyway, there's like a bunch of different ways that I would be worried about how the kind of average person on the street experiences a democracy in decline, both in the, what are our civil rights and liberties? Are we safe to walk down the street or not? But also, what does it mean when I show up to the doctor and all of a sudden the vaccine that I want to give my child is 1,000% more expensive or no longer free because a pharmaceutical company has been able to get access to jack up the prices. So anyway, there's like very concrete ways that this starts to affect people the more you see erosion and the more you see corruption pervade throughout the government.
Nate, any closing thoughts from you to this conversation?
Well, I mean, it's been great to talk with you all. I just wanted to restate something Angela said earlier, which is, institutions to rebuild, not just policies to be passed. I do think that that's the core of this, and that the future of this is about, rebuilding American institutions, possibly transforming them. I think that this is going to be a time when we're going to have to think very hard about what's feasible, obviously politically or practically, but also to be ambitious and to think. I mean, part of what has made this decline so dramatic, and part of why I feel very comfortable saying that it's been so dramatic, is that there has been a movement and an effort that is very ambitious, right? So on the other side, we see a very ambitious effort to transform American democracy and American government into something else. And that's what's happening right now. And I think that so I do think that the counter to that, or that the next move in response to that, when there's an opportunity, will have to be equally ambitious, if not more so, because it's not sustainable to swing back and forth between these things. The institutions get weaker and weaker the more you kind of toggle back and forth. And I think that it'll be very important to shore them up and to rebuild them in different ways and in new ways that would be more sustainable and less vulnerable, frankly, to capture and erosion.
Yeah, and I'll just say one thing that's sort of credo of how I've understood a lot of politics in the U.S. and in foreign contexts that I've worked, which is that people like democracy, people like rights, people like being treated with respect by the people who have guns in their country. It's like a thing that all over the world, people dislike being abused by the authorities, and they like being treated like humans by the authorities. That's like just a thing. And essentializers would have us believe that that's not the case, that, some people like authoritarianism, or some people are happy to trade civil rights and democracy for like a slight increase in their per capita GDP. I haven't found that. I think there's a real sort of robust body of evidence that people like that and view it as a good in its own right? That if you talk to a person in Egypt or in Minneapolis or Venezuela or any place, they'll say, I like being able to afford tomatoes, and I like not being bribed, being forced to bribe a cop or being thrown in jail for something I didn't do. So I like that we're able to put a little bit of a number on this and track our feeling of anxiety against some kind of established measures, and also that we can sort of see a path to improvement. Like, maybe it won't happen, but there is a route to something better. So our listeners can read this report on the Century Foundation's website. That is tcf.org. The report is called Century's New Democracy Meter Shows America Took an Authoritarian Turn in 2025. We've been speaking today with Nate Schenkkan, an independent democracy researcher, and Angela Hanks, the director of policy programs here at the Century Foundation. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, director of Century International, and this is Order from Ashes. If you like this podcast, please leave a review, share with your friends, and we'll be back next week to talk about, I think, reconstruction in Syria, unless some other crazy thing has happened between now and then. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
The Order from
From Ashes podcast has been brought to you by Century International. Our work builds on more than 100 years of commitment to international peace, security, and governance at the Century Foundation. We are independent, critical, and progressive. For more information about Century International's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We depend on audience feedback to reach new listeners. If you like what you hear, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.